On Tuesday, President Trump visited the St. John Paul II Shrine on the 41st anniversary of the saint's first visit to his native Poland. That visit hastened the fall of the Soviet Union. The president called upon the nations of the world to put an end to religious persecution. He later signed an executive order that dedicates $50 million for programs that advance international religious freedom. For his reaction to this story and more, we're joined by Papal Posse member, editor of The Catholic Thing, Robert Arroyo. Bob, there was a huge showdown over the president's visit to the JP2 shrine. The Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Gregory, wrote, "I find it baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated in a fashion that violates our religious principles." Your reaction: is the signing of an executive order on religious liberty and a visit to a Catholic shrine a violation of religious principle?
Yeah, I think that this statement was an absolute disaster, frankly. That the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., which is to say the capital city of the United States of America, must be able to be the Archbishop of both Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. And that statement, whether it was written by Archbishop Wilton Gregory or not, seems to accept the kind of politicized reading of the day before, when President Trump visited St. John's Episcopal Church in Lafayette Square, which is the square right in front of the White House. And he read it as if this was a photo op, another photo op, which was the way the New York Times and others read what happened in Lafayette Square the day before. Yeah. In point of fact, this had been scheduled far in advance of that particular date. And I can't imagine, I haven't been able to get an answer to this, but I can't imagine that the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. was not invited to that event, either by the White House, or if not the White House, by the Knights of Columbus, who run that JP2 Cultural Center. And if it were me, I would have actually been there, whatever my feelings about the president, love him, hate him, whatever, because this was a chance to honor JP2 and to make an important statement about religious liberty. Instead, what we got is this very regrettable statement saying it's baffling and reprehensible, as if all this was a photo op. I think that someone's head should roll in that chancery, because they didn't even bother to check their own records. I'm sure they were aware of this.
Yeah, no, I was stunned by the statement. And, you know, the Washington Post called me for reaction after it happened. And my first thought was, a shrine, everyone should be welcome at a Catholic shrine to begin with. Everybody. The church, Pope Francis has said this is a field hospital for sinners. Well, Donald Trump may need that field hospital as well. And if you're entrusted with the gospel as a pastor, your obligation is to extend that message of salvation, particularly to someone you disagree with or think is a sinner of the greatest magnitude, which apparently they think he is. This is a moment to engage him and help save a soul. Why wouldn't you do that? So I was stunned by it, and the reprehensible and baffling for a diocese that still has not yet come clean about the McCarrick situation and what they know and those documents. We're still waiting 2 years. This month is 2 years since McCarrick was removed and stripped of his offices for his grave and disgusting misdeeds. We still don't have answers, Bob.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, McCarrick was a master manipulator of the politics in the United States. If you can say one thing about Archbishop Gregory, he stayed actually out of the public eye greatly. I was talking with a Catholic journalist, a very fine Catholic journalist, just yesterday, and she mentioned that he hasn't made very many statements at all. Now, he did make a previous statement after the killing of George in Minneapolis, and it was okay in the sense that he referred to Martin Luther King and the beloved community and nonviolent protest. All that was quite good, I thought, and was very good in particular because this is the only African-American archbishop, Catholic archbishop in the United States. And so he occupies not only the post in Washington, but a prominent post for blacks in general in the United States. However, and I think that this was a very, very bad step to take, he compared the death of George to some of the deaths during the civil rights movement of people who were seeking justice. I mean, whatever else you can say about George, he was not a choir boy. And this happened. I still think it was a crime, and I'm glad that the police who did this were arrested. But we cannot have in the United States, every time a person of color suffers an injustice, we can't continually compare this to the civil rights era. It is not that. This is not a lynching. This was a crime that was committed by people who will pay for it. In my judgment, other than the way that the academic world and media and Hollywood now continue to try to deliberately exacerbate the racial relations in the United States, along with groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Other than that, most Americans get along with one another. Whites try to get along with blacks try to get along with whites, Hispanics, Asians, etc. We are not, as a country, in a situation of systematic racism. Systematic racism is like what you had in South Africa under apartheid. What we have now are lingering effects of racism, pockets of extremely biased and sometimes violent people. But when that emerges and we see something like this happen, we cannot constantly drag the country back to the most troubled times in race relations. That is not going to solve this problem. It's only going to exacerbate things further. And this is actually from the playbook of groups like the ancient Marxists, who always used to talk about heightening the tensions. They love to create these divisions within people. I mean, this is a diabolical way to think about societies. And I hope and pray that in the future, a figure like Archbishop Wilton Gregory will take it on himself to say, there's a future day. There's a future day. Yes, we remember those hurts of the past, but we do not have that systematic legal discrimination against anybody any longer, that the law is the same for everyone. And our goal is going forward to make sure it's applied equally to everyone.
I want to get your reaction to Pope Francis's comments this week on the death of George Floyd. He said this: "I've witnessed with great concern the disturbing social unrest in your nation in these past days following the tragic death of Mr. George Floyd. My friends, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. At the same time, we have to recognize that the violence of recent nights is self-destructive and self-defeating. Nothing is gained by violence, and so much is lost." Bob, your thoughts? Unlike many others who have commented, Pope Francis did call out both the sin of racism and the violence being perpetuated at these protests.
Yeah. Look, I think that statement was a well-balanced statement. It's always iffy for somebody outside of a country to comment on what's going on inside of a country, especially if you don't know the country well, and the Pope does not know America well, as we are quite aware. But that's sort of the kind of thing that we need to promote healing. Sure, there is racism in the world, but we are not in the same place that we were in even just a few short decades ago, where there were actual legal impediments to people moving forward in our society. Right now, if you ask me, the biggest problems that we encounter in our society are cultural ones, that the commanding heights of the culture, which is to say mostly the media, our academic world, etc., only understand things in terms of race, class, and gender. Those are very narrow ways to look at the world. A Christian needs to also look at the fact of evil. There is evil in the hearts of human beings. The police officer who killed George Flynn knew him previously. They had worked together as bouncers, I guess, in a nightclub or something. There may actually be a personal factor. There may be a racial factor in this too, but there are all sorts of things that were going on there. So, yeah, we all, who is in favor of racism in this day and age? Only people from the fever swamps. But at the same time, what we have to look at is the rule of law and order in a society is what makes a civilized society possible in the first place.
Yeah, we can't have a situation where those who destroy more win, and that the whole society is forced to bend and to dispense with the rule of law and order because some people are aggrieved. And here's the real juice of this entire situation. The people who are most justified in being aggrieved are not the ones committing these reckless acts of looting and burning. It's not the black community. It's a lot of white kids, to my eye, as I see them and as I talk to people in law enforcement in New York, here in New Orleans. In New Orleans, we had a protest. It's almost entirely white. There are not many black faces on the I-10 here stopping the flow of traffic. So it's very interesting what's happening across the country, and we do have to delve into that as well and see who's really at these protests. What are they really asking for? And is this a just way to go about achieving justice, racial justice or otherwise? Very quickly, Bob, Father James Martin weighed in on the tragic death of George Floyd. He tweeted, after being brutalized and humiliated by civic authorities and being pushed to the ground as a crowd watched, this innocent man was killed ultimately by asphyxiation, not by loss of blood. And in his final moments, he cried out for a drink of water and spoke to his mother. He's obviously trying to make the comparison between Jesus Christ and George Floyd. Is that apt?
Well, yes. I mean, there were actually two pictures. If I remember this right, there was a drawing of Christ on the cross. I mean, look, this is utterly extreme. All evils that take place in the world, in a sense, are related to the way that Christ was crucified and horribly tortured on the cross, and so he gathers all that stuff up. But we're not talking even about a normal person who was unjustly killed in an unfortunate circumstance, and to try to portray everyone who is a victim of injustice as somehow Christ-like, I think is just inappropriate. It isn't the proper register, particularly when we're living in a society where the tensions and voices are just so overheated. We much more need to try to pour some oil on the waters. I hope Archbishop Gregory will do this in the future. He's going to be speaking tomorrow, on Friday, by the way, at Georgetown University. There's going to be an online conference, a discussion about racism in the United States and whatnot. And I hope he sets the record a little bit straight on this. But we're exalting these unfortunate circumstances into cosmic things. You see the same sorts of protests in England and in Australia, countries that are very different from our own, but have their own ethnic problems internally. I kind of think of this as displaced religion. People aren't allowed to be outraged about abortion any longer. They aren't allowed to be outraged by insults to their nations, to their locales, to their families. And so people are passionately moral beings, and instead they've displaced this onto what is truly a moral question, to be opposed to racism. But they've poured so much emotion almost uniquely into this one thing that it's obliterated all other understandings of truth and value.
No, it is like a secular religion, Bob. And when you watch it play out with the hand gestures, hands up, kneel down, I mean, it's practically liturgical. And I also think that it's the perfect storm because you had a justifiable outrage, and then you have scads of people, particularly young people, locked in their homes for 4 months who now suddenly get a hall pass if they go and protest. So, of course, the streets are filled. People don't even know why they're protesting sometimes. I've heard some of these interviews. They don't know. It's very vague here. But they show up, they're loud, they're acting out, and they don't have to social distance, which is a nice caveat. Now, speaking of politics and faith, two prominent U.S. bishops, as you mentioned, spoke out about George Floyd's death, Archbishop Wilton Gregory, and then the other cardinal, Joseph Tobin of Newark, said the murder of George Floyd, which is simply the latest instance of a person of color dying at the hands of those sworn to protect the community, has provoked justified anger and peaceful protest across the United States. Violent rhetoric, selfishness, and even the crude appropriation of religious symbols conspire to produce a malevolent miasma in which the sin of racism may flourish unchecked. Our society will make no progress in addressing the evil of racism without the will to leave behind the purveyors of polarization. Bob, that last portion clearly is an attempt to jab the president for his appearances, I guess, at St. John's Episcopal and the JP2 Shrine. Are you concerned about the blatant partisanship being expressed in that statement from a Catholic cardinal?
Well, unlike the papal remarks, I don't see any criticism of the eruption of criminality and self-indulgence also that's come about as a result of this. I mean, no one is opposed to peaceful protest. Even President Trump, as far as I'm aware, he's never said that people cannot protest and should not be angry. And he's described the killing in Minneapolis as very regrettable, et cetera. But instead, what we're seeing is that a lot of other things are being loaded onto this. And I mean, we aren't even sure. I go back to this point that that policeman knew this man. We are not even sure how much racism was clearly a part of this, but we're not sure how much a part of it was. There may have been a personal grudge that was being carried out here. So again, to load this up and is in a way, as you're trying to overcome racism, you're actually exacerbating it. We are, as citizens living well with one another, being respectful to one another, we are slowly overcoming that horrible history of slavery and racism that existed in the United States. We are not going to overcome it by massive protests that only kind of raise the voices louder and louder and louder and politicize absolutely everything till we get to the point that it's the war of all against all, which is the definition of what you get when you no longer have civilization.
Right. I fear we're there, Bob. And not only in society, in the Catholic Church as well. And it has made everything toxic. Everything. And the words you hear flying around, the charge, it's frightening is what it is. And it's deeply troubling, I think, to many people around the nation and the world watching this play out.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that most Americans are deeply, deeply distressed about the violence and the disorder and the criminality that we've seen. And look, as Christians, we must understand it's not only others who have to choose between good and evil. That, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn famously once said, the line between good and evil runs through the middle of every human heart. We are all sinners, and we all need to decide between good and evil. But we do not simply decide that because people are on the right side and they're protesting, and others happen to be in the neighborhood, that it's okay for whatever they decide to do under the impulse of other people's anger and justified protest about an injustice that has occurred. Underneath the surface of civilization, there's always this need for police, for we hope nonviolent religious and other voices to be heard, but police, armies, etc., because evil is resurgent. Evil is in all of us, and it must be constantly fought against in our own hearts and in the public realm as well.
I agree. Bob, we'll leave it there for now. Robert Royal's always insightful columns can be found at thecatholicthing.org.